The fluorescent lights of the diner buzzed overhead as Margaret Chin wiped down the counter for what felt like the 100th time that evening. Her reflection in the chrome napkin dispenser showed a woman in her early 70s, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that still held a sharp, observant quality despite the weariness that had settled into the lines around them. The red uniform she wore, with its white apron and small name tag that simply read Maggie, had become like a second skin over the past 15 years. Outside, the California coastal town was settling into its usual evening rhythm. Cars passed by on the highway, their headlights cutting through the growing dusk. The diner sat at the edge of town, a stopping point for travelers heading north or south along the coast, and for locals who appreciated the consistency of good coffee and honest food. Margaret had worked there since her retirement, taking the evening shift that nobody else wanted, serving truckers, families, and the occasional military personnel from the nearby base. She moved with practiced efficiency, her body remembering the choreography of service even when her joints protested. Refill the coffee, clear the plates, smile at the customers, wipe the tables. The routine was comforting in its predictability, even if it wasn't what she had imagined doing at this stage of her life. But life rarely went according to plan, and Margaret had learned that lesson more thoroughly than most. The door chimed as a group of young men entered, their loud voices and boisterous energy filling the quiet space. They were college-aged, wearing expensive sneakers and designer jackets, the kind of customers who often treated service workers as invisible or inconvenient. Margaret recognized the type immediately. She had served thousands like them over the years, young people who had never learned that respect wasn't something you only gave to people you considered important. They sprawled across two booths, pushing tables together without asking, their phones out, and music playing from a small speaker one of them produced from his backpack. Margaret approached with menus and water glasses, her professional smile firmly in place. "Good evening, gentlemen. Welcome to Coastal Diner. Can I start you off with something to drink besides water?" Her voice was pleasant, courteous, the practiced warmth of someone who had perfected customer service over decades. One of them, a young man with carefully styled hair and a smirk that suggested he found his own thoughts endlessly amusing, barely glanced up from his phone. "Yeah, we'll take 5 Cokes. And make sure they're actually cold this time. Last place we stopped, the drinks were basically room temperature." Margaret nodded, making a note on her pad, even though she would remember. "Of course, I'll have those right out for you. Have you had a chance to look at the menu, or would you like a few more minutes?" Another one laughed, nudging his friend. "Nah, we need a minute. Unless you want to tell us what's actually good here." His tone carried a challenge, as if he expected her to be offended or flustered. "The pot roast is excellent," Margaret replied evenly. "We also have a very popular chicken fried steak, and our burgers are made fresh daily. The soup today is loaded baked potato, and it's quite good if you're looking for something warming." "We'll let you know," the first young man said dismissively, turning back to his phone as if she had already ceased to exist. Margaret returned to the kitchen, placed the drink order, and continued with her other tasks. She had 3 other tables to attend to, a couple celebrating an anniversary, a tired-looking woman with 2 small children, and a solo trucker who sat at the counter working his way through a slice of apple pie. Each received her full attention, her genuine care for their comfort and satisfaction. This was how Margaret approached her work. Every customer deserved good service regardless of who they were or how they treated her. When she returned with the drinks for the rowdy table, the young men had gotten louder. Their conversation was peppered with casual profanity, jokes at each other's expense, and the kind of posturing that young men often engaged in when trying to impress their peers. Margaret set down the drinks carefully, pulling out her order pad. "Have we decided what we'd like to eat this evening?" she asked. The ordering process was deliberately difficult. They changed their minds multiple times, asked her to describe items in detail, and then ordered something completely different, made substitutions that would complicate the kitchen's work, and spoke over each other so that Margaret had to ask for clarification repeatedly. Through it all, she remained patient, writing everything down carefully, confirming each order to make sure she had it right. As she turned to head back to the kitchen, one of them called out, "Hey, waitress, can you actually remember all that? Or should we be worried about what we're going to get?" His friends laughed, and Margaret turned back with the same pleasant expression. I'll make sure your orders are exactly right, gentlemen. If there are any problems, please let me know and I'll fix them immediately. In the kitchen, she clipped the order tickets to the line and took a moment to roll her shoulders, easing the tension that had settled there. The cook, a man named Ramon who had worked at the diner for 20 years, glanced at the complicated order and then at Margaret with sympathy in his eyes. Rough table, he asked in his accented English. They're young, Margaret replied simply, as if that explained everything. And in a way it did. She had been young once too, though she couldn't remember ever being quite that thoughtless. The evening wore on. Margaret brought out the food, each plate prepared exactly as ordered despite the complications. She checked on the table regularly, refilled drinks without being asked, and maintained her professional demeanor even as the young men's behavior deteriorated. They were louder now, bothering the other customers with their volume. One of them had spilled his Coke, and rather than apologizing or trying to clean it up, he had simply laughed and left it pooling on the table, dripping onto the floor. Margaret cleaned it up without comment, bringing fresh napkins and wiping down the table and floor. As she knelt beside the booth to get the spill on the vinyl seat, one of them looked down at her and smirked. "Missed a spot," he said, pointing to an area she had already cleaned. She straightened up, her knees protesting the movement. "Is there anything else I can get for you, gentlemen?" "Yeah," one of them said, pushing his plate forward. It was still half full of food. "This is cold. I want a new one." Margaret looked at the plate. The food was clearly still steaming. "I'm sorry, sir. Would you like me to have the kitchen warm it up for you?" "I said I want a new one," he repeated, his voice taking on an edge. "You know what? Never mind. The food here is garbage anyway." His friends laughed, encouraging him. Margaret picked up the plate without argument. "I'll take this off your bill, of course. Can I get you something else instead?" "Nah, we're good," he said, leaning back in his seat with a satisfied expression, as if he had won some kind of victory. Margaret returned to the kitchen with the plate. Ramon looked at it, and then at her, shaking his head. "Nothing wrong with that food." "I know," Margaret replied quietly. She wasn't angry, just tired. Tired in a way that went deeper than the physical exhaustion of being on her feet for hours. It was the tiredness that came from being dismissed, from being treated as less than human by people who should know better. As the evening continued, the young men's behavior worsened. They left trash on the floor deliberately, wadding up napkins and dropping them. They made increasingly inappropriate jokes, some of which carried racial and sexist undertones that made Margaret's jaw tighten even as she maintained her pleasant expression. They snapped their fingers at her to get her attention, a gesture she found particularly demeaning but endured nonetheless. The other customers were beginning to look uncomfortable. The couple celebrating their anniversary asked for their check early, and the mother with the 2 children kept glancing nervously at the loud table. Margaret apologized to them quietly, her professionalism never wavering even as she felt the situation slipping out of her control. When the young men finally asked for their check, Margaret calculated it carefully, removing the item that had been complained about and double-checking all the other charges. She presented it in the small leather folder the diner used, setting it on the table with a polite, "Whenever you're ready, gentlemen. There's no rush." They let it sit there for 15 minutes while they continued their loud conversation, ignoring her even when she passed by. Finally, one of them grabbed it, looked at the total, and laughed. "You expect us to pay this much for that garbage food?" "The prices are listed on the menu, sir," Margaret replied calmly. "And I did remove the item you weren't satisfied with." "Yeah, well, the service was terrible too," another one chimed in. "You were slow, you got our orders wrong, and honestly, you're too old to be doing this job anyway. Maybe it's time to retire, Grandma." The words hung in the air. Margaret felt something inside her chest tighten, but she kept her expression neutral. "I apologize if the service didn't meet your expectations. The bill is correct as itemized. I can break it down further if there's a specific charge you're questioning." One of them pulled out his wallet with exaggerated slowness, making a show of counting out bills. He dropped them on the table, not handing them to Margaret, but leaving them scattered across the surface along with the loose change from his pocket. The total came to exactly what was owed, not a penny more. "There you go," he said. "Maybe spend less time chatting with the cook and more time doing your job, and you might actually earn a tip someday. They stood up, laughing among themselves, and headed for the door. As they passed the counter where the trucker still sat nursing his coffee, one of them bumped into Margaret deliberately, not hard enough to knock her over, but enough to make her stumble. "Oops," he said with mock concern. "Careful there, Grandma. Wouldn't want you to break a hip." She worked methodically, scrubbing and wiping, her mind drifting as her hands performed the familiar motions. This wasn't the first time she had been treated poorly, and it probably wouldn't be the last. Service work attracted this kind of disrespect sometimes, especially from people who saw servers as beneath them. But it never quite stopped hurting, that casual cruelty, that assumption that her dignity was somehow less important because she wore an apron and served food. Margaret's manager, a stressed-looking woman named Denise who spent most of her time in the back office dealing with paperwork and supplier calls, emerged as Margaret was finishing the cleanup. Denise had the harried expression of someone who was perpetually behind on everything, and her greeting confirmed Margaret's suspicion that something was wrong. "Maggie, can we talk in the office for a minute?" Denise's voice carried a tone that Margaret recognized immediately. This wasn't going to be a pleasant conversation. Margaret followed her back, past the kitchen where Ramon gave her a concerned look, and into the cramped office that smelled of old coffee and printer toner. Denise sat down behind the cluttered desk and gestured for Margaret to take the folding chair opposite her. She didn't meet Margaret's eyes as she shuffled some papers, a sure sign that she was uncomfortable with whatever she was about to say. "I'm going to be direct because I respect you too much to dance around this," Denise began, finally, looking up. "Corporate has been on me about labor costs. They want me to reduce evening shift coverage, and they've been particularly focused on our more senior employees." Margaret felt her stomach drop, but kept her expression neutral. "I see. You're one of our best workers, Maggie. You really are. You're reliable, you're good with customers, you never complain. But you're also at the top of the pay scale because of your years here, and, frankly, they can hire someone younger for a lot less money." Denise looked genuinely pained. "I fought this. I really did. But I don't have a choice anymore. They're cutting your hours down to 2 shifts a week, and those will be split shifts during the slowest times." Margaret absorbed this information slowly. 2 shifts a week during slow times meant her income would be cut by more than 70%. It meant she wouldn't be able to afford her small apartment. It meant her carefully managed budget, already stretched thin, would collapse completely. "Is this because of those young men tonight?" Margaret asked quietly. "Did they complain?" Denise looked confused. "What young men?" "No, Maggie, this has nothing to do with tonight. This has been in the works for weeks. Corporate sent down the directive last month. I'm sorry, I should have told you sooner, but I kept hoping I could change their minds." There was a strange relief in knowing that the evening's humiliation hadn't directly caused this, but it was cold comfort. Margaret nodded slowly, processing what this meant for her life. At 72, finding another job would be nearly impossible. She had her social security, but it wasn't enough to live on alone. She had been counting on this job, on the routine and the income and the sense of purpose it provided. "When does this start?" she asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "Next week's schedule," Denise replied. "Again, I'm really sorry, Maggie. If it was up to me, you'd be working as many hours as you wanted. You're the kind of employee every manager wishes they had more of." Margaret stood up, smoothing down her apron. "I understand. Thank you for letting me know." She turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Denise, I've enjoyed working here. You've been a good manager, and I want you to know I don't blame you for this." Back in the dining area, Margaret finished her shift with the same professionalism she always brought to her work. She served her remaining customers with care, cleaned her station thoroughly, and counted out her register with her usual precision. The tips for the evening were decent overall. The trucker had left her $20 on a $15 check, and the anniversary couple had been generous as well. But the missing tip from the young men's table felt like an additional insult on top of an already difficult night. As she hung up her apron in the back and retrieved her worn purse from her locker, Ramon approached her. He had heard about the hour cuts from Denise. The kitchen staff always knew everything that happened in a restaurant. "This is wrong, Maggie," he said, his accent thickening with emotion. "You work harder than anyone here. Those corporate people, they don't see that. They just see numbers. It's business, Ramon, Margaret replied, though her voice lacked conviction. They have to make decisions based on profit. It's not right, he insisted. You deserve better. Margaret gave him a tired smile. We all deserve better than we get sometimes. That's just life. She walked out to her car, a 20-year-old sedan that she maintained carefully because she couldn't afford to replace it. The parking lot was mostly empty now, the diner settling into the quiet hours before the late-night crowd would arrive for the graveyard shift. Margaret sat in the driver's seat for a long moment before starting the engine, letting the weight of the evening settle over her. The drive home took 15 minutes, through streets she knew by heart. Her apartment was in an older complex on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where the rent was affordable because nothing had been updated since the 1980s. She parked in her assigned spot and climbed the exterior stairs to the second floor, her knees protesting each step. Inside her small one-bedroom apartment, Margaret finally allowed herself to feel the full impact of the day. She sat down on the worn couch that had been with her for decades, too tired even to change out of her uniform, and stared at the wall where a few framed photographs hung. One showed a much younger version of herself in a crisp naval uniform, standing at attention with pride evident in every line of her posture. Another captured her receiving a commendation, shaking hands with a senior officer while other personnel looked on. Those photos were from another lifetime, from when Margaret Chun had been Lieutenant Commander Chun, a naval intelligence officer with a distinguished career spanning 30 years. She had served during the Cold War, analyzing Soviet communications and contributing to operations that most people would never know about because they remained classified. She had been good at her job, brilliant even, speaking 4 languages fluently, and possessing an analytical mind that could spot patterns others missed. But that career had ended, as all careers eventually do, and retirement had come with its own challenges. Her husband, also a naval officer, had died just 3 years after they both retired, his heart giving out suddenly, during what was supposed to be the beginning of their golden years together. The medical bills from his final hospitalization had been substantial despite their insurance, and Margaret had found herself widowed and financially strained. She had taken the job at the diner because she needed the income, but also because she needed the structure, the sense of purpose. After decades of meaningful work, of contributing to national security and being part of something larger than herself, retirement had felt hollow. The diner job wasn't prestigious, but it was honest work, and Margaret had always believed in the dignity of honest work regardless of what form it took. Now even that was being taken from her, reduced to a few hours a week that wouldn't be enough to sustain her. Margaret looked at her younger self in the photograph, at the woman who had been trusted with classified information and critical analysis, and wondered what that version of herself would think of where she had ended up. The next few days passed in a blur of routine and worry. Margaret worked her remaining full shifts at the diner, already mentally preparing for the reduced schedule that would start the following week. She began looking at her finances, trying to figure out how she could possibly make things work on such a drastically reduced income. The math was unforgiving. Even if she cut every unnecessary expense, she would still fall short of what she needed for rent, utilities, food, and her medications. She considered her options, few as they were. She could look for another job, but at 72 with limited recent work experience outside of food service, the prospects were bleak. She could move to a cheaper apartment, but the waiting lists for affordable senior housing were years long. She could ask her daughter for help, but Sarah had her own family to support and was already stretched thin raising 3 children on a teacher's salary. Pride had always been one of Margaret's defining characteristics, sometimes a strength and sometimes a weakness. She had never wanted to be a burden on anyone, had always insisted on making her own way. But pride didn't pay rent, and she was running out of choices. On her second-to-last full shift, something happened that would change everything. Margaret was working the dinner rush, moving between tables with practiced efficiency despite the exhaustion that seemed to go bone deep these days. The diner was busy, filled with the usual mix of locals and travelers, the noise of conversation and clattering dishes creating a familiar soundtrack. A group of men entered, 6 of them, and Margaret noticed them immediately for several reasons. They moved with a distinctive bearing, a kind of alert awareness and controlled confidence that she recognized from her years around military personnel. They were fit, their casual clothes couldn't hide the athletic builds underneath, and they had the weathered look of people who spent significant time outdoors in harsh conditions. Most telling were their haircuts, practical and short, and the way they scanned the room before choosing a table, assessing exits, and sight lines unconsciously. Military, Margaret thought, probably from the nearby naval base. She had served enough military personnel over the years to spot them easily. These men had the additional edge of special operations about them, something in the way they carried themselves that suggested they were used to operating at a higher level of intensity than regular forces. They chose a large table near the back, arranging themselves so that no one's back was to the door. Margaret approached with menus and her standard greeting, noting the tattoos visible on a couple of forearms, the kind of ink that often told stories of deployments and brotherhood. "Good evening, gentlemen. Welcome to Coastal Diner. Can I start you off with something to drink?" Her tone was professional and warm, the same way she greeted every customer. The man closest to her, who seemed to be the informal leader of the group, looked up with a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Coffee would be great, ma'am. Black. And probably a pot of it if you don't mind. We've got some catching up to do." "Of course," Margaret replied. "I'll bring out a full pot and some extra cups. Have you gentlemen been on the road long?" "Long enough." Another one answered as Margaret took their orders. She noticed details about each of them. One had a wedding ring and kept checking his phone, probably looking at pictures of his family. Another had a healing scar on his forearm, the kind that suggested a recent deployment to somewhere dangerous. A third wore a bracelet with coordinates engraved on it, likely marking a significant location from a mission. These were men who had seen combat, who had put themselves in harm's way for their country, and they treated her with unfailing respect and courtesy. "Ma'am, what do you recommend?" asked the youngest-looking member of the group, who couldn't have been more than 25. Margaret considered the question seriously. The pot roast is always reliable, very tender. The chicken fried steak is popular if you want something hearty. But if you've been eating field rations, you might appreciate something with fresh vegetables. The grilled chicken with the seasonal vegetable medley is quite good, and the vegetables are actually cooked properly, not overdone. He grinned. "Sold. I'll take the chicken." As she went around the table, Margaret found herself genuinely enjoying the interaction. These men reminded her of the personnel she had worked with during her naval career, the ones who did difficult jobs without complaint and treated others with dignity regardless of rank. They were polite without being overly familiar, respectful without being stiff, and their humor was the kind that built people up rather than tearing them down. When she brought out their food, perfectly prepared and steaming hot, one of them looked up at her name tag and said, "Maggie, this looks outstanding." "Thank you." "You're very welcome," she replied. "If you need anything else, just let me know." As the evening progressed, Margaret checked on them regularly. They were model customers, not demanding but appreciative, patient when the kitchen was backed up, understanding when she was pulled away to attend to other tables. At one point, when she apologized for a slight delay in refilling their coffee, the leader of the group shook his head. "Ma'am, you don't need to apologize. We can see you're running between like 6 tables right now. You're doing a great job." It was such a contrast to how the young men had treated her just days earlier. These warriors, these men who had every right to expect good service given what they did for their country, treated her with more respect than those privileged boys who had never served anyone but themselves. Toward the end of their meal, as Margaret was clearing some of their plates, one of them, a man with gray at his temples and sharp, observant eyes, studied her for a long moment. There was something in his expression, a recognition of sorts, though Margaret couldn't imagine what had sparked it. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said carefully. "I hope you don't mind me asking, but did you serve in the military?" Margaret paused, surprised by the question. She rarely talked about her service anymore. In her uniform and apron, serving coffee and clearing plates, she was just Maggie the waitress, and most people never looked beyond that surface to imagine she might have had another life. "I did," she replied simply. "Navy. I retired about 15 years ago." The man's expression shifted, becoming more intent. "What did you do in the Navy, if you don't mind me asking?" "I was in intelligence," Margaret said, not elaborating. Even after all these years, the habit of discretion remained strong. I served for 30 years. There was a ripple of reaction around the table. The men exchanged glances, their postures shifting subtly. The man who had asked the question leaned forward slightly. 30 years in Navy intelligence. That's impressive, ma'am. What rank did you retire at? Lieutenant Commander, Margaret replied, wondering where this was going. The leader of the group, who had been listening to this exchange, set down his coffee cup carefully. Lieutenant Commander, with 30 years of service in intelligence. Ma'am, I need to ask, and I apologize if this seems forward, but is your last name Chun? Margaret felt a strange flutter in her chest. Yes, it is. How did you know that? The men were all staring at her now. Their expressions transformed from casual friendliness to something approaching awe. The leader stood up, and, after a moment's hesitation, the others followed suit. They came to attention, a formal military posture that looked slightly out of place in the casual diner setting, but unmistakably sincere. Ma'am, the leader said, his voice taking on a formal quality. Are you Lieutenant Commander Margaret Chun, who served with Naval Intelligence during the Cold War and was involved in Operation Silent Shield? Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. Operation Silent Shield was classified, had been classified for decades. It had been one of her most significant contributions, a multi-year intelligence operation that had identified and neutralized a major espionage network. Her work had been crucial to its success, but it wasn't something that should be common knowledge, even among military personnel. I can neither confirm nor deny involvement in any classified operations, she said automatically, the old protocol kicking in. The man smiled slightly. Understood, ma'am. But some of those operations have been partially declassified in recent years, at least among certain communities. Your name came up in our training, in case studies about exemplary intelligence work. You're something of a legend, ma'am. Margaret didn't know what to say. A legend? Her? She was a 72-year-old woman serving coffee in a diner, about to have her hours cut to almost nothing because she was too expensive to keep on staff. The disconnect between how these men were looking at her and how she saw herself was dizzying. I think you have me confused with someone else, she said weakly. I was just an analyst. I sat at a desk and read reports. With all due respect, ma'am, another one of the men spoke up. You did a lot more than that. The intelligence you gathered and analyzed saved lives. American lives, Allied lives. The networks you helped dismantle would have done serious damage if they'd been allowed to continue operating. Margaret felt tears pricking at her eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. She had done her job, yes, and she had done it well. But in the years since retirement, especially in the years since her husband's death and her reduced circumstances, she had sometimes wondered if any of it had mattered. If her service had made a real difference. If she had made a real difference. Thank you, she managed to say. That means more than you know. The leader, who had introduced himself as Commander Mitchell during the meal, stepped forward. Ma'am, I have to ask, and please forgive me if this is too personal, but what are you doing working here? Someone with your record, your experience, your years of service, you should be consulting, teaching, doing something that uses your skills. Margaret almost laughed, though there was no humor in it. Commander, I'm 72 years old. The world doesn't have much use for elderly intelligence analysts, especially ones whose experience is mostly from before the digital age. I work here because I need the income and because I need something to do with my days. The men exchanged glances again, something unspoken passing between them. Ma'am, Commander Mitchell said slowly. Would you be willing to sit down with us for a few minutes when your shift ends? There's something we'd like to discuss with you. Margaret glanced around the diner. It was getting toward the end of her shift, and the crowd was thinning out. Denise was in the back office as usual, and the other server could handle the remaining tables. I suppose I could, she said uncertainly. I get off in about 20 minutes. We'll wait, Mitchell assured her. And, ma'am, we'd like to pay for our meal now. I think we'll be here for a while longer. When Margaret brought their check, she found that they had already calculated a generous tip, nearly 50% of the bill. Gentlemen, you don't need to do this, she protested. Yes, ma'am, we do, one of them replied firmly. You served our country with distinction for 3 decades. Buying you dinner is the least we can do. The 20 minutes passed in a blur. Margaret finished her closing duties, said goodnight to Ramon, who looked curiously at the table of military men who were still waiting, and hung up her apron. She felt strange approaching them as something other than their server, like she was crossing some invisible line. They had rearranged themselves to leave space for her at the table, and Commander Mitchell gestured to the seat. "Please, ma'am, join us." Margaret sat down, her hands folded in her lap, suddenly nervous in a way she hadn't been since she was a young ensign. These men, despite their respect for her past service, were warriors in their prime, active duty personnel who operated at the highest levels. What could they possibly want to discuss with her? "Ma'am," Mitchell began, his tone respectful but direct, "we're SEALs, part of a team that's currently stationed at the base about 30 miles from here. We rotate through for specialized training before deployments. The reason we know about your work is because it's part of our intelligence training curriculum. Your analysis techniques, your approach to pattern recognition and communications, it's still being taught because it's still relevant." Margaret listened, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. Her work still being taught? Still relevant after all these years? Another SEAL, who had introduced himself as Lieutenant Cordova, leaned forward. "I actually wrote a paper on Operation Silent Shield at the Naval Academy, ma'am. Your work on that operation was brilliant. The way you connected seemingly unrelated pieces of information, the patience you showed in tracking patterns over months and years, it set a standard for how intelligence work should be done." "I had a good team," Margaret said automatically. "Intelligence work is always collaborative." "But you were the one who saw the connections," Mitchell pressed. "You were the one who pushed for continued surveillance when others wanted to move on. You were right. And because of your persistence, a major threat was neutralized." "Ma'am," Mitchell continued, "I want to be direct because I think you'd appreciate that. It's clear that you're working here because you need to, not because you want to. And while there's absolutely nothing wrong with honest work of any kind, it seems to me that someone with your skills and experience could be contributing in other ways." Margaret felt a flash of defensiveness. "I'm too old to go back into intelligence work, Commander. The world has changed. Everything is digital now, computers and cybersecurity. I'm from the era of coded messages and radio intercepts." "Human intelligence hasn't changed, ma'am," Cordova interjected. "Technology has changed, but the fundamentals of analysis, of understanding patterns, of thinking strategically about how adversaries operate, that's timeless. You have knowledge that can't be replaced by algorithms or artificial intelligence." Mitchell nodded. "We have a problem in the intelligence community, ma'am. We have a lot of young analysts who are brilliant with technology but lack the experience, the instincts that come from years of actual operational work. We have programs designed to bridge that gap, to bring in retired personnel as consultants and trainers. Your name has been mentioned in those contexts, but no one knew where you were or if you'd be interested." "Programs," Margaret repeated, trying to process what she was hearing. "What kind of programs?" "Several kinds," Mitchell explained. "There are civilian contractor positions with the Navy and other intelligence agencies working on historical analysis and training development. There are teaching opportunities, both at military educational institutions and in private sector security firms. There are consulting roles where your experience would be invaluable. Ma'am, someone with your background and clearance level, even if it needs to be reactivated, you could write your own ticket." Margaret stared at him, wanting to believe, but afraid to hope. "I've been out of the field for 15 years. Why would anyone want me now?" "Because institutional knowledge is being lost," another SEAL, who had identified himself as Chief Ramirez, spoke up. "We're losing the generation that served during the Cold War, and with them, we're losing decades of experience and expertise. The Navy has been working on oral history projects, trying to capture some of that knowledge before it's gone. You could contribute to that. You could help train the next generation. You could consult on current operations where historical context matters." It sounded too good to be true, the kind of thing that happened in movies, but not in real life. Not to 72-year-old waitresses who were about to have their hours cut. But these men were serious, their expressions sincere, their respect for her evident in every word and gesture. "I don't know," Margaret said slowly. "I've been out of that world for so long. I wouldn't even know where to start." "We can help with that," Mitchell assured her. "In fact, if you're willing, I'd like to make some calls tomorrow. I have contacts at the Naval Intelligence Command who would be very interested in talking to you. No pressure, no obligation, just a conversation about possibilities. Margaret thought about her reduced hours at the diner, about the impossible math of her finances, about the long empty days stretching ahead with nothing but worry to fill them. Then, she thought about her years of service, the satisfaction of meaningful work, the sense of purpose that had defined most of her adult life. I think, she said carefully, I think I'd be interested in having that conversation. The SEALs smiled, genuine pleasure evident on their faces. Outstanding, ma'am, Mitchell said. I'll need your contact information, and I'll reach out to you tomorrow with some names and numbers. I think you're going to be surprised at how much interest there is. They talked for another hour, the SEALs sharing stories from their training and deployments, asking Margaret about her experiences during the Cold War, treating her not as an elderly waitress, but as a respected colleague. It was intoxicating being seen this way, being valued for her mind and experience again. Margaret found herself laughing, something she realized she hadn't done genuinely in weeks, and sharing memories she hadn't thought about in years. When they finally prepared to leave, each SEAL made a point of shaking her hand and thanking her for her service. Commander Mitchell was the last to go. He paused at the door, looking back at her. Ma'am, I want you to know something. When we teach young SEALs about intelligence work, about patience and perseverance and thinking 3 steps ahead of the enemy, we use your operations as examples. You're not forgotten. Your work mattered then, and it still matters now. After they left, Margaret sat alone at the table for a long moment, processing everything that had happened. The diner was nearly empty now, just a few late customers and the overnight staff starting to filter in. She felt dazed, like she had stepped through a doorway into an alternate version of her life. Ramon emerged from the kitchen, having finished his closing duties. He sat down across from her, his expression curious. Those military guys, they stayed a long time talking to you. Something good. I think so, Margaret replied, still not quite believing it herself. I think something very good might have just happened, Ramon. But I'm almost afraid to hope. Hope is good, Maggie, Ramon said warmly. You deserve good things to happen. You work hard. You're kind to people. You deserve more than scraping by serving coffee. That night, Margaret drove home in a state of cautious optimism. She kept replaying the conversation in her mind, examining it for signs that she had misunderstood or exaggerated what the SEALs had said. But no matter how many times she reviewed it, the message was clear. They had recognized her, known her work, and believed she still had something valuable to offer. For the first time in years, Margaret allowed herself to imagine a different future. Not one of diminishing returns and increasing struggle, but one where her experience was valued, where she could contribute meaningfully again, where she wouldn't have to worry about making rent or affording her medications. The next morning, Margaret was up early despite the late night, too energized to sleep. She made coffee and sat at her small kitchen table, looking at the old photos on her wall with new eyes. That young lieutenant commander staring back at her, that wasn't just a memory of who she had been. Maybe, just maybe, there was still something of that person in her, something that could be called back into service. Her phone rang at 9:30, earlier than she had expected. The number was unfamiliar, but Margaret answered anyway, her heart beating faster. Miss Chun, this is Commander Mitchell. I hope I'm not calling too early. Not at all, Margaret assured him. I've been up for hours. Good. Ma'am, I've made several calls this morning, and I have to tell you, the response has been overwhelming. I spoke with a captain at Naval Intelligence Command, a director at a private intelligence training firm, and a colleague who runs a consulting group that works with DoD. All of them want to talk to you. All of them have potential opportunities. Margaret sat down heavily, her legs suddenly weak. All of them. Really? Ma'am, you have no idea how valuable your experience is, Mitchell said. And she could hear the smile in his voice. The captain I spoke with actually said, and I quote, if you can get Margaret Chin interested in coming back in any capacity, make it happen. Apparently, your reputation precedes you. They talked for 20 minutes, Mitchell walking her through the different opportunities, explaining what each would entail, offering to set up phone interviews or meetings. By the time they hung up, Margaret had appointments scheduled for the following week with 3 different organizations, each one interested in her skills and experience. She sat staring at her phone for a long time after the call ended, feeling like she had woken up in a different life. How had this happened? How had one chance encounter, one table of seals who recognized her name, transformed everything so completely? Margaret thought about the young men who had treated her so poorly, who had made her feel invisible and worthless. They had no idea who she was, what she had done, what she was capable of. They had seen an elderly waitress and assumed that was all there was to see. But they had been wrong. She was so much more than that, had always been so much more than that. And she had just needed someone to remember. Her shift at the diner that evening felt surreal. Margaret went through her usual routines, but her mind was elsewhere, planning and hoping and imagining. Denise approached her during a quiet moment, looking uncomfortable. "Maggie, about the schedule cuts," she began, but Margaret held up a hand. "Actually, Denise, I need to talk to you about that. I'm going to need to request some time off next week for some appointments. And I'm going to need to give notice soon. I've had some opportunities come up." Denise's eyes widened. "Opportunities? That's wonderful, Maggie. Of course you can have the time off. Can I ask what kind of opportunities?" "The kind that use my actual skills." Each organization treated her with respect, valuing her experience and expertise. They asked thoughtful questions about her past work, listened carefully to her answers, and made it clear that they saw her not as a charity case or a token senior hire, but as someone who could make genuine contributions. The compensation they offered was substantial, far more than she had been making at the diner, enough to not only cover her expenses but to rebuild her savings and security. Margaret accepted the position with the Naval Intelligence Command, feeling that returning to naval service, even as a civilian contractor, was coming home. The work would be part-time, but engaging, allowing her to maintain some flexibility while making meaningful contributions. She would work primarily from home, with occasional trips to the base for meetings and training sessions. Her security clearance would be reactivated, a process that would take a few months, but which everyone assured her would be straightforward given her record. 2 weeks after the SEALs had walked into the diner, Margaret gave her notice at Coastal Diner. Denise was genuinely happy for her, though she admitted the timing was perfect since corporate had been pushing for even deeper cuts. Ramon made her a special farewell dinner, and the staff gave her a card and a small gift. It was a bittersweet ending to that chapter of her life. Margaret's last shift at the diner fell on a Thursday evening. She arrived for her shift expecting it to be like any other night, planning to work her tables, serve her customers, and then say her goodbyes at the end. But as she pushed through the front door, she stopped in surprise. The diner was full, far fuller than it should be for a Thursday. And as Margaret's eyes adjusted, she realized that many of the customers were military personnel, men and women in uniform or civilian clothes, but with that unmistakable bearing. And there, at the back table, were Commander Mitchell and his team of SEALs, all of them standing as she entered. "What is this?" Margaret asked, bewildered. Mitchell stepped forward, a smile on his face. "Ma'am, word got around the base about you, about who you are and what you did. A lot of us wanted to be here for your last shift, to say thank you, to show you the respect you deserve." Margaret felt tears pricking at her eyes again. The diner, her workplace of 15 years where she had felt increasingly invisible and undervalued, was filled with service members who had come specifically to honor her. As she stood there, taking it in, the military personnel in the diner came to attention, a spontaneous show of respect that made her breath catch. "Thank you," she managed to say. "But you didn't need to do this." "Yes, ma'am, we did," Cordova replied. "You served with distinction for 3 decades. You made contributions that most people will never know about, but that kept all of us safer. You earned this recognition, and a lot more besides." Margaret worked her last shift serving a diner full of military personnel, each one treating her with utmost respect and courtesy. They asked about her service, shared their own stories, and made sure she knew that her work had mattered. The tips were generous, far more than appropriate, and several people left notes with their contact information, offering to help however they could as she transitioned to her new role. Toward the end of the shift, Commander Mitchell gathered everyone's attention. He stood up, and the diner grew quiet. "I'd like to propose something," he said. "Lieutenant Commander Chin spent 30 years serving our country in naval intelligence, doing work that saved lives and protected national security. She has served with distinction, with honor, and with dedication. I think she deserves to be recognized properly." He turned to Margaret, his expression serious. "Ma'am, if you would do us the honor, we'd like to render a proper salute. Your service deserves to be acknowledged." Margaret didn't know what to say. She had never sought recognition, had always just done her job to the best of her ability. But looking at these men and women, these warriors who put themselves in harm's way every day, she felt something shift inside her. They saw her, really saw her, not as an elderly waitress, but as a fellow service member, as someone who had contributed to the mission they continued to carry out. "I would be honored," she said quietly. The military personnel in the diner came to attention, a coordinated movement that spoke of training and discipline. And then, as one, they saluted. Row after row of raised hands, the formal military salute held with precision and respect. Margaret, standing in her diner uniform at the end of a long shift, found herself coming to attention automatically, returning the salute with the same crispness she had used decades ago. The moment stretched out, profound and moving. This was recognition, true recognition, not of her current circumstances, but of her service, her contributions, her worth. These warriors, these men and women who understood sacrifice and dedication, were honoring her as one of their own. When they dropped their salutes, the diner erupted in applause. Margaret wiped at her eyes, not bothering to hide the tears anymore. Mitchell approached her, extending his hand. When she took it, he said quietly, "Thank you for your service, ma'am. It's been an honor." "The honor has been mine," Margaret replied, her voice thick with emotion. As the evening wound down, the military personnel began to leave, each one stopping to shake Margaret's hand or offer a word of thanks. She felt surrounded by respect and appreciation, a stark contrast to how she had felt just weeks earlier when those young men had treated her with such contempt. The last to leave were the SEALs, Mitchell's team lingering until the diner was nearly empty. They gathered around Margaret one final time, and Mitchell handed her an envelope. "Ma'am, this is from the team. Just a little something to help with your transition." Margaret opened it to find a card signed by all of them, along with a substantial check. "Gentlemen, I can't accept this," she protested. "Yes, ma'am, you can," Ramirez said firmly. "Consider it back pay for all the times your work saved lives, and you never got properly thanked. Consider it an investment in your next chapter. Consider it whatever you want, but please take it." Margaret looked at their faces, saw the sincerity there, and nodded. "Thank you, all of you. You've given me back something I thought I'd lost." "What's that, ma'am?" Mitchell asked. "Purpose," Margaret replied simply. "The belief that I still have something valuable to contribute, that I still matter." "You always mattered, ma'am," Cordova said. "Some people just forgot to look beyond the surface. But we see you. We know who you are and what you've done, and we're honored to have met you." After they left, Margaret finished her closing duties for the last time. She hung up her apron, said goodbye to Ramon, who was crying unashamedly, and walked out into the night. Her car sat in the parking lot, the same aging sedan she had been driving for years, but somehow the world felt different now, fuller of possibility, fuller of hope. Margaret drove home through familiar streets, but instead of feeling trapped by routine and limited options, she felt like she was driving towards something new. Her phone had been buzzing all evening with messages, colleagues from her Navy days who had heard she was returning to intelligence work, offering congratulations and expressing interest in reconnecting. In her apartment, surrounded by the photos of her younger self and memories of her late husband, Margaret sat down and allowed herself to fully process what had happened. A chance encounter, a moment of recognition, had transformed everything. But it wasn't really chance, she realized. It was the natural consequence of a life lived with integrity and dedication. Her work had mattered, had left an impact that rippled forward through the years, touching people she had never met but who knew her name and respected her contributions. The young men who had treated her so poorly in the diner, who had seen her as beneath them, as unworthy of basic respect, they would never know what they had missed. They had been in the presence of someone who had served her country with distinction, who had made contributions they could never understand, and they had seen only a waitress. Their loss, their inability to recognize worth in unexpected places, had revealed more about them than it ever could about her. Margaret thought about the contrast between those two groups of young men. The college boys who treated service with contempt and people with casual cruelty. The Navy SEALs who recognized that every person has value, that service of any kind deserves respect, that you never really know what someone has done or what they are capable of until you take the time to see them as a complete human being. In the following weeks, Margaret began her new role with Naval Intelligence Command. The work was challenging in the best way, requiring her to dust off skills she hadn't used in years while also learning new approaches and technologies. Her younger colleagues treated her with a mixture of respect for her experience and eagerness to learn from her. She found herself energized, engaged, feeling more like herself than she had in years. She kept in touch with Commander Mitchell and his team, occasionally meeting them for coffee when they were in the area for training. They had become friends, bonded by mutual respect and an understanding of service and sacrifice. Mitchell told her that her story had spread through the SEAL community, becoming a reminder to always look beyond the surface, to recognize that everyone has a history and that worth isn't determined by current circumstances. One day, several months after leaving the diner, Margaret received a package in the mail. Inside was a plaque, beautifully made, with an engraving that read, Lieutenant Commander Margaret Chun, U.S. Navy Intelligence, in recognition of 30 years of distinguished service and lasting contributions to national security. It was signed by her commanding officer from her final posting, someone who had tracked her down specifically to make sure she received proper recognition. Margaret hung the plaque on her wall, next to the photos of her younger self in uniform. But she also kept her name tag from the diner, that simple plastic rectangle that read Maggie. It served as a reminder that every person, no matter what job they do or what they look like, has a story, has worth, has something to contribute. She thought about writing to the young men who had treated her so poorly, about telling them who she really was and what they had missed. But she decided against it. The lesson wasn't for her to teach them directly. The lesson was for everyone who might hear her story, a reminder that kindness costs nothing and that every person deserves basic human dignity and respect. Margaret continued her work with Naval Intelligence, contributing to training programs and historical analysis projects, mentoring young analysts, and sharing the wisdom gained from 3 decades of service. She gave occasional lectures at the Naval Academy, talking about intelligence work during the Cold War and the timeless principles of effective analysis. Students and colleagues alike valued her insights, her patience, and her ability to connect historical experience to contemporary challenges. Her financial situation stabilized and then improved. She was able to move to a better apartment, one with a view of the ocean that reminded her of her years of naval service. She rebuilt her savings, traveled to visit her daughter and grandchildren, and generally lived with a security and comfort she had feared was lost forever. But more than the financial improvements, what truly transformed Margaret's life was the restoration of her sense of purpose and value. She was no longer just getting through her days, marking time until the inevitable end. She was contributing, making a difference, using her skills and experience in ways that mattered. The years of feeling invisible and diminished fell away, replaced by engagement and satisfaction. ND experience, Margaret replied with a smile. The kind I thought I'd never have again at my age. Word spread quickly through the diner staff. Ramon was delighted, insisting on making her a special meal to celebrate. The other servers, who had always liked Margaret but perhaps never really known her, looked at her with new curiosity. Even some of the regular customers, hearing that she might be leaving, expressed surprise and wished her well. The interviews the following week went better than Margaret had dared to hope. The Naval Intelligence Command wanted her to consult on historical analysis projects and help develop training materials. The private firm offered her a position as a senior analyst, working on contract intelligence assessments. The consulting group wanted her to mentor young analysts and provide expertise on long-term intelligence operations. Margaret felt something loosening in her chest, some knot of doubt and diminished self-worth that had been tightening over the years. She had done good work, she realized. Important work. Work that had mattered and apparently still mattered. With a grin. And we're looking forward to some food that doesn't come out of a package or a can. Margaret smiled. Then, you've come to the right place. Our pot roast is excellent tonight. And we have fresh-baked rolls. Take your time with the menus. I'll be right back with that coffee. As she walked away, she heard one of them say, "Did she call us gentlemen? That's refreshing. Last 3 places we stopped, we got looked at like we were going to rob the place." She returned with the coffee pot and cups, setting them out efficiently. The men were engrossed in their menus, discussing options with the easy camaraderie of people who had been through difficult things together. Their conversation was peppered with military terminology and good-natured ribbing. The door chimed as they left, their laughter fading as they walked toward their expensive car in the parking lot. Margaret stood there for a moment, collecting herself, before she began gathering the bills and change from the table. Her hands, she noticed, were shaking slightly. The trucker at the counter had watched the whole exchange. He was a man in his 50s with weathered skin and kind eyes, wearing a flannel shirt and a cap with a trucking company logo. "That was disgraceful," he said quietly. "Those boys should be ashamed of themselves." Margaret managed a small smile. "It's all right. Some people just have bad days." "That wasn't a bad day," the trucker replied. "That was bad character. You handled it with more grace than they deserved." As Margaret began clearing the table, she found the full extent of the mess they had left. Food ground into the seats. Ketchup smeared deliberately on the underside of the table. Napkins stuffed into the gap between the seat and the wall. It would take her 20 minutes to clean it properly, time she didn't really have with her other tables waiting.